Hello, and welcome to The Real American Revolution, a public television series devoted to interviewing authors and historians about what really happened during our American Revolution. Now, my name is Randy Flood, and this program is brought to you by two nonprofit entities, the Real American Revolution public television series and the American Revolution Consortium for Civic Education. Today, my guest is Jack Buchanan. Now, Jack is one of our nation's foremost historians on the American Revolution and is affectionately known as the Dean of the Southern Campaigns. Now, born in Glen Falls, New York, Jack grew up in upstate New York, Michigan, and Ohio. Following military service in the United States Army from 1951 to 54, he graduated from St. Lawrence University with the highest honors in history, magna cum laude, and was elected to Phi Beta Kappa. Now, after teaching high school in upstate New York, he was assistant archivist in the collection of regional history and university archives at Cornell University. In 1966, he joined the staff of the Metropolitan Museum of Art as museum archivist, and in 1972 was appointed chief registrar of the museum. Now, upon his retirement, he returned to the study of history, and his books on the Revolution include the prize-winning The Road to Valley Forge, How Washington Built the Army That Won the Revolution, and the widely acclaimed The Road to Guilford Courthouse, The American Revolution in the Carolinas. Now, Jack's most recent book, The Road to Charleston, Nathaniel Greene and the American Revolution, has also become a bestseller. So, Jack, welcome to the show. And today we're going to be discussing your book, The Road to Valley Forge, How Washington Built the Army That Won the Revolution. So let me hold it up here for our viewers to see. It's an excellent book. Of course, I love you reading all your books, but so let's begin, okay? In The Road to Valley Forge, you really compare and contrast Sir William Howe and George Washington, not only as soldiers, but also as products of their societies. How were Washington and Howe the same, and how were they different?
Well, they were both at the top of the heap in their respective societies, as far as social class went. Howe was an aristocrat. Family held an earldom. His brother was the 4th Viscount Howe. And it was a very small group of people that then ruled England. He looked down upon the rest of his countrymen as lesser beings. Really did. I mean, that's the way they were then. Washington was not an aristocrat. I've always maintained that America has never had a true aristocracy. A lot of pretenders, a lot of scribers, but not a true aristocracy. He was a member of the gentry class. That was the top class in America at the time. And he had a rather jaundiced view of his lessers. He once wrote of them, and I quote, "the grazing multitude," end quote. So they were the same in that respect. They were also the same in their concept of honor, especially the officer class in those days. If you flinched, if you ran, if you showed fear in the face of danger, you were forever disgraced in the eyes of your society. And so there's this rigid concept of honor. You did not flinch. And both of these men rode into battle often and put their lives in danger to inspire troops to show them that they were right up there where the action was. So they were alike in that respect. They were much different in military experience. Howe had been a soldier for 30 years. He'd taken part in battles. He'd taken part in sieges, the siege of Louisburg. It was Howe, as a colonel, who led the forlorn hope up those precipitous cliffs onto the plains of Abraham during the French and Indian War. And the battle that ensued on those plains outside Quebec City led to the expulsion of France from North America. So he was well known, and he was also an authority on the use, the raising, the training, and the use of light infantry, which was an excellent type of outfit to use under North American conditions. Mm-hmm. So he was a real pro. when the revolution started. Professional officer to his core. Washington was a frontier soldier. He had never commanded regulars until the revolution. He commanded militia. He commanded the 1st Virginia Regiment, which was looked down upon by the British. And in fact, Washington's craving ambition was to get a commission in the regular British Army. And well, that's just an aside, but what if he'd gotten one? What would have happened when it came to the break? Would he have obeyed his oath to the king, or would he rebel? It's an interesting question. Anyway, he didn't have anywhere near the experience. When he was 21 years old, he was sent by the governor of Virginia, the royal governor, to deliver a message to the French at Fort Duquesne, which eventually became Fort Pitt. At Fort Duquesne, that they had to vacate the Ohio country. This was Virginia territory. I carried that out. Then the following year, at 22, he led the expedition to evict the French. And of course, that was a total failure. He was lucky to get out of it alive. And the only really top-notch experience he had as a soldier is when he served under General John Forbes. Forbes led the expedition that eventually evicted the French from the Ohio country, took Fort Duquesne, and didn't see any action, but he learned a lot under Forbes, and Forbes evidently liked him. Forbes didn't like most colonial officers, called them a bunch of horse traders and jockeys, but he liked Washington. And evidently it was Washington who formed a plan for 4,000 men to march in frontier conditions in deep woods at the time. But he had nowhere near the experience when he and Howe came to face each other. So that was the differences and the sameness.
Interesting. Well, when talking about Washington, I was reading in your book, what did Washington mean when writing a letter assessing the abilities of General John Sullivan of New York when it was put to him? He wrote, "His wants are common to us all, the want of experience to move upon a large scale." What did that mean?
And he was absolutely right. All, with possibly one exception, and I'll get to that, all of the Continental officers, they were militia commanders. Many had participated in bush warfare or guerrilla warfare during the French and Indian War. In fact, Israel Putnam probably went back into some of the earlier wars. So they were small-time militia commanders. They had never commanded regulars, and they had never commanded big armies on the field in the European sense of the word, when armies wheeled and marched and deployed in the hundreds, the thousands, the tens of thousands sometimes. They had no experience in that. And he was right. He would go on to say, we have experience, we know a lot from books, and we will learn to move on a large scale, and they did. I really don't think Sullivan did. I never thought much of Sullivan. but that's what he meant. They had no experience in the deployment and operational experience in handling huge numbers of men in the field.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, after numerous defeats on Long Island, while attempting really to defend New York City from the British, Washington really was in full-scale retreat across New Jersey. Now, Howe sent Lord Cornwallis to New Jersey to pursue Washington and the Continental Army. But was it really a pursuit? Why didn't Cornwallis, who later proved in the South that he was very ruthless in hot pursuit of trying to catch Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan before they reunited across the Dan River, why didn't he pursue and destroy Washington and his army when at their possibly weakest moment, at the weakest stage of the army?
This is really an interesting question. First, Sir William. Sir William had been against the war. He was a member of the opposite party. had been against the war, and really was in favor of conciliation. And then, after he got there, his brother arrived. Vice Admiral Richard Lord Howe, 4th Viscount Howe. And he was he was sent both as a naval commander and as a peace commissioner. One of the few times, if there were any times, I think, when a commanding officer sent to make war was also a peace commissioner. And he insisted that his fellow peace commissioner be his brother, Sir William. Mm-hmm. So, and Lord Howe was especially in favor of conciliation rather than destruction. So the tale is really told in New Jersey when Washington's retreating and Cornwallis has crossed the river, he's sent across the river. He has elite units with him, Brigade of Guards, 33rd Foot, and others. And he has these elite units with him. And a German commander, Johann von Ewald, and his Jaegers made contact with some American forces, skirmished with them, and sent for reinforcements. Ewald was recalled. And Cornwallis says to him, "Let them go, my dear Ewald. There's no sense in taking any losses at this time." And so Ewald pulls back. And later, and Ewald has in his diary, and it's a wonderful diary, Ewald has in his diary a couple of remarks on this. He says, "Now I see what was afoot. They meant to make peace, to end this whole affair amicably and not waste the lives of their subjects." Something to that effect. And Johann Hinrichs, another German officer, practically wrote the same thing. And Ewald said at one time, he came to that conclusion, and then he said he was assured that was true the following day by several British officers, that they weren't out really to destroy the Continental Army. So Washington got away.
Interesting. That's very interesting. Jack, let's talk about George Washington as a tactician. Do you think he was a good tactician? And what are your thoughts about, for example, his tactics during the Battle of Germantown?
Yes. No, he wasn't a good tactician. He at times was a good strategist, and I'll have more to say about him later as commander-in-chief. He was not a good tactician. And also, you know, he had a penchant for complex night operations. Now, two of them really worked. The withdrawal from Long Island after the Battle of Long Island, and this horrendous defeat on the part of the British, and his retreat across the East River to Manhattan at night in a fog. Well, that had to be done. It was either get out or be destroyed. Mm-hmm. And that worked. That worked perfectly. Then the Trenton operation, that worked beautifully. He got across the river with the main body, and as we all know what happened at Trenton. But there were also two other units downstream who were also supposed to cross and come up from the other side of Trenton. Well, they never made it. They never got across the river. And then, of course, the third time was the Battle of Germantown. Mm-hmm. And that really beggars belief. 3 columns in the wee hours in a dense fog on 3 different roads, advancing and supposed to arrive at the same time at the jump-off point and attack. Mm-hmm. I mean, even today, with well-trained troops and our instant communications, that would be tough to pull off. Anything could happen. Well, of course, it did go wrong. They kept dribbling in. Greene especially was late because he had a long way to go. And then the second incident at Germantown, even though when they initially began the attack, of course, they caught the British by surprise. Even the light infantry fled. British light infantry, elite unit, they fled. They came to the Chew Mansion, which the British were barricaded inside. And there he was urged to bypass it and keep going, leave them there. And maybe, leave a guard around to make sure they didn't get out, but bypass it and go on. But Henry Knox, going back to his reading in military history, never leave a fortress in your rear. And Washington bought the argument, and it was, well, let's see, 1st Pennsylvania and I think 2nd New Jersey. They took horrific casualties trying to burst their way into that building.
That was the Chew House.
That was the Chew House, yes. It was a big brick, 2-story, might have been a 2-story house.
Yeah, 23-inch walls.
Yes, the British were inside, and that's right. And the rebel artillery made no dent in those walls. They bombarded, but made no dent. Blew the windows open and couldn't even break the doors open. Many of the American troops were bayoneted as they were trying to climb in the windows. So there was a mistake. And then the third thing that he did, as far as tactics are concerned, 1791, he makes his Southern tour as president. And on his way back, he toured the field of Guilford Courthouse and spent quite a bit of time there touring that battlefield. 2 years later, he told Jefferson, and Jefferson wrote it all down, that Greene had made a mistake, and that he and Greene had always differed how to use militia in a set-piece battle. And of course, what Greene did, he used Daniel Morgan's method. Daniel Morgan taught the lesson how to use militia with regulars. Put them in the front line to soften up the approaching enemy, try to pick off the officers and sergeants, but you don't have to stay there, boys. You don't have to stay there. Give me 2 or 3 rounds. And he had the militia in 2 lines, skirmishers and then a regular line of militia, and then you can retreat behind my main line of resistance where the regulars are. Well, we all know that worked to perfection at Cowpens, and we used the same method at Guilford Courthouse, and in a way it worked. It inflicted grave casualties on the British Army. In fact, the British Army was crippled, really, after Guilford Courthouse. But Washington maintained that this was wrong. He should have put the regulars in the front line, the militia behind, because he said the militia are fine fellows if they don't have to be in the front line. And I think he was dead wrong.
Interesting. Yeah, I find that fascinating. Yeah. Well, Jack, one final question. What's the takeaway from the road to Valley Forge that every American needs to know? What really happened that perhaps has been lost to history or perpetuated in myths as we know myths to be?
Well, I don't know if it's been lost, but I think, those 2 years, 1776, 1777, they were the 2 most critical years for George Washington as commander-in-chief. He could have lost it all had he been up against a really ruthless enemy. And it was the 2 critical years for the British. Those were the 2 years when they had their best chance to win the war, and they blew it. I think that has to be taken away. And then the other thing that should be taken away too is, Charles Lee, he was probably, I mentioned before, there was probably one American officer. He wasn't American, he was British, but he had turned rebel. General Charles Lee wanted to fight it as a guerrilla war. That would have been a disaster. It would have been, it invited all the horror of the Civil War in the South and the Civil War in upstate New York in the Mohawk and Susquehanna valleys. It would have invited into the whole country. Washington, I think, was absolutely right that we're going to fight this as a regular war with regular units. And he did use militia well as far as for scouting, intelligence, keeping the Tories at bay, keeping them down, and so forth. So in addition to these two critical years, I think they really have to be recognized as the most critical years of the war.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, interesting.
I once heard a talk by Gordon Wood on Washington. You know, the great Gordon Wood, he's probably the preeminent revolutionary scholar, American scholar. And Gordon Wood at the end of his talk said, and he was talking on Washington, weren't we lucky? And we were.
Mm-hmm.
You know, James Thomas Flexner in his 1-volume synopsis of his 4-volume biography of Washington, titled The Indispensable Man. And I think he was the indispensable man. He was not a very good tactician. His strategy at times was so-so. Operationally, he liked these complex night movements and everything. He was a great commander-in-chief. And he was a nationalist at a time when a lot of Americans were localists. They loved their state, or they loved their county, or their city. But he was an American. And he gave off that message throughout the war. Mm-hmm. Great commander-in-chief. And the other thing he did, and you know who did this later, was Dwight Eisenhower during World War II. He was not only a nationalist, he worked so well with the French. As Eisenhower worked so well during World War II with the British and with the French and other allies. He was just a great man. So yeah. I think that's something that I tried to get that across in the summing up, that with all his faults, and he had faults, we all have faults, but he truly was the indispensable man, I think. Yeah.
Well, Jack, that looks like all the time we have today, but thank you so much for joining us for an enlightening discussion about the road to Valley Forge. Folks, this is the book, one more time, The Road to Valley Forge, and it's available from Amazon and other outlets. It's an outstanding book. I know you'll enjoy it. Jack, thank you so much.
Thank you, Randy.
Yep. Today, our guest has been author and historian Jack Buchanan. Join us again for the Real American Revolution and the American Revolution Consortium for Civic Education when we interview other outstanding historians about the real American Revolution. Have a great day.